Good morning and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at the key developments in and around the European Union in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, are Janis Emmanouilidis, EPC Director of Studies, and Fabian Zuleeg, the EPC's Chief Executive. And we are delighted to welcome our special guest this week to look back at the past year and ahead to the one to come, Herman Van Rompuy, President of the EPC and, of course, President Emeritus of the European Council. As always, a totally interactive discussion, questions from me to our panel, and later on, I hope from all of you. Just a quick reminder, if you want to ask a question in writing, use the Q&A box, not the chat, the Q&A, and please keep your question brief. And if you want to speak your question, as it were, click on the raised hand buttons and I will allow you to talk when the time comes. If you're having IT issues, use the chat button and we will try to help you. So, Herman Van Rompuy, President Van Rompuy, great to have you with us. Some first reflections as we look back, if you would, over the last 12 months to where we are now, assessing now the state of the Union.
Yeah, how to summarize this and how to find the right words. Ursula von der Leyen last year spoke about how turning, I think that she used the word vulnerability into vitality. I would rather speak of turning fear into hope. Because the successive waves of the pandemic have led to despair, not to hope. And there are signs of hope. I will be as positive as I can be. A main sign of hope, of course, is a vaccination. It's a great victory for science, by the way. Vaccination itself has led to a great deal of solidarity and voluntary work. You shouldn't forget that. We are always saying, and I'm saying, that we live in an individualistic period. But I saw a lot of solidarity during those last 18 months. The emergence, of course, of the Delta variant has tempered the joy somewhat. But this wave is different from the previous ones. Less deadly, certainly, for the vaccinated. And coming back to the European Union, the Commission was strongly criticized for the vaccination policy, which in itself was a good thing. The joint purchase of vaccines so that all countries had equal access to them and could also emerge from the crisis at the same time. Again, solidarity. The start of the vaccination process was difficult, but the catching up in most countries was spectacular. The gap, even with the Anglo-Saxon countries, has been closed for many countries. Another sign of hope is that the economic recovery is stronger than expected. For a number of countries, it's a kind of V-curve. In my country, we had a recession of -6.3%, and we are expecting this year a growth of 5.3%. It's almost a V-curve. Not in every country, but in some of the countries in Western Europe, it's the case. The Recovery Fund, another sign of hope, is more focused on structural improvement of the economy of a number of countries, which is so necessary to strengthen their growth potential and to set public debt problems under control. The Recovery Fund is also the means of realizing the Green Deal, that the biggest project of the Commission, I think the biggest project in the European Union since the single market of Jacques Delors. For this reason alone, Green Deal, climate change, there will be no business as usual, not a back to normality. And hopefully also the digital revolution will also be translated into productivity gains, especially in the countries which have experienced slow growth in recent decades. My last reflection is at this stage of our conversation. A major problem, however, is whether public opinion sees these signs of hope. Question mark. A part of the population is disappointed with the European Union because there was not enough Europe. That's the good thing, and at the same time, it's a sad thing because it's turning against Europe. But they are asking what we call more Europe, especially when it comes to travel. There is a great uncertainty. Those who during the migration crisis questioned the openness of the Schengen area are now calling for precisely that freedom of movement. So they are asking much more openness inside the European Union. And in the beginning of the pandemic, they were asking for more European coordination. On the other hand, the zigzag policy of national governments has also caused much dissatisfaction. Hopefully, I spoke regularly about hope, but this time, hopefully, populism will not come out of this stronger, although they did not know how to behave at the beginning of the pandemic. Populists want to be popular, but what is popular today? My experience of the last weeks is governments relax sometimes quicker than a majority of the population often expected, which is also something that is strange. So next year we will have elections in France and in Germany, and I will end on a positive note in this introductory remarks. I think that France and Germany will still have pro-European leaders, and we will speak I think in the second part of our conversation about the future. But I'm hopeful, I'm confident that the two leading countries in the European Union, France and Germany, will have governments that are in favor of more Europe and more European integration.
Thank you very much, and lots to come back to on each of those points that you made in our discussion. But Fabian, for you, President Van Rompuy there referring to Ursula von der Leyen's sort of leitmotif for her speech last year, which, as he said, talked about vulnerability, talked about turning fragility towards a new vitality. Obviously, everything has been overshadowed by COVID, but do you feel there are areas in which at least we have moved further on the path towards that new vitality, or are you more gloomy about where we are now?
I think we have seen a lot of progress. We shouldn't forget that the moment we were in last autumn was also a very difficult moment because there was that great hope before the summer that things would be starting to normalize, that things would be starting to get under control, and obviously we have seen that this pandemic is far more difficult to get under control, that in some ways we might be talking about some form of permanent accommodation with this. So we have to find a way of also integrating that into what we are doing economically, socially. So I think, yes, we have seen that difficult moment. We've seen progress on a number of areas despite that difficult moment. And I think that's to the credit. But we've also seen that in some areas we have not moved ahead, that we still have significant areas of conflict also between the member states. And I think the difficulty, I would say, is still to come. And we are now, I think, at a crucial point in the pandemic. As I've said before in these updates, I think how things work out this summer is going to be a very important moment for the citizens to decide whether Europe works or not. We now have this great promise of the COVID certificate that you're able to travel. For many people this summer, this will be the test. They will be going to the airport, going across borders with a certificate in hand. And if that doesn't work, or if we are seeing that some of the things which have been happening this summer are leading to a resurgence of the pandemic, in particular to the variants, which are worrying, then I think we might be in a much worse place again at the beginning of autumn. So a lot hinges on the next few weeks.
Thank you very much indeed. And we will come back. And as you say, things were difficult last autumn, a hope of normalization that wasn't realized. And we may be in the same situation again because of the variant. So we'll come back on that and whether we're better prepared if we don't normalize as much as we'd hoped a bit later on. But Janis, your overall assessment, are you glass half full, glass half empty at this moment?
I'm not in a gloomy mood, and I don't think that we should be in a gloomy mode. Yes, Fabian is right. There are a lot of uncertainties, so it's difficult to make a judgment as to where we will be in a year's time. But if I look back over the past year or the past 18 months, if I look back into February, March of last year, I think the potential of this crisis spiraling out of control, the potential of the negative effects, and I'm talking about multiple negative effects, not only the economic ones, but also the political ones, the societal ones, maybe even you can say the cultural ones, because this is a very deep-rooted crisis, which I think is changing a lot of things in our societies. The potential of the negative consequences of this crisis were huge. And if I look back over the past 1.5 years, my worst case scenario, which I had come up with by myself at that moment in time when it started, the crisis started, would have looked extremely negative. So compared to that, I think we should not be gloomy. We have gone through different phases. We've gone through an initial moment which was negative, where we had national reflexes. We also had chaos. Then we went into a more positive moment with flexibility regarding state aid, Stability and Growth Pact, the ECB bazooka, which many of us tend to forget how quick it came, PEP, the agreement on NextGenerationEU. I think all these were positive elements. Then we had another negative phase in the beginning of the vaccination process, where I think the vaccination drama is still in the minds of many citizens. And they also identify it as something which it was a European mistake. If you look into the details, and we discussed that in many of our updates, the picture is much more complex, and the responsibilities are definitely not on the shoulders of the EU or its institutions. It's much broader if you look at it. But since then, the situation, and Herman was alluding to that, also when it comes to vaccination, has enormously improved. So I think we've gone through these ups and downs. But compared to what I was expecting or potentially expecting at the beginning as a worst case scenario, that didn't materialize. So I'm definitely not on the side of the half empty.
Thank you. Let's just stick with the pandemic and the handling of the pandemic for a moment, if we could. And Janis was describing there those negative phases, positive phases. It is quite striking in the UK that a lot of criticism of the government's handling of the pandemic changed completely with the vaccination program because of that early success. Herman, from your perspective, as you look, you talked about those difficulties at the beginning, but you said the joint procurement was the right thing to do. And as you say, spectacular catch up now. Do you believe that the EU has done enough to convince citizens and wipe out some of those concerns at the beginning of the vaccination program and some of those concerns about the chaos at the beginning? Have they done enough, do you think, to convince the public that the EU is part of the solution? And are we in a better place as we look? We'll turn to the future challenge and what happens this summer and beyond. But do you think the EU has responded and undone some of the public image damage, even if, as Janis says, some of it wasn't their fault? Where are we now in terms of attitudes towards the European Union and its role in this pandemic?
Mm-hmm. I said at the end of my short introduction that I was asking if public opinion is perceiving what we called signs of hope on the vaccination front and on the economic side. And asking the question is answering the question. The answer is they don't perceive it as such, because each day there is another problem. If the vaccination is going well, they want to travel, as Fabian said, and if there are problems with traveling, they're still in a mood of what's happening, what's happening in Europe. It's not working or not working enough as we wish, and and so on. So it is there. I think that what we objectively notice is not translated yet, or not translated in a positive appreciation of the public. But let us not forget that Europe is not the only actor in all this. When in this country, when we speak about vaccination, people are not referring to Europe anymore. They are referring to the national, the regional, even the local authorities who are in charge of the vaccination process. And if the vaccination operation is a success, it's in some way people are giving this the credit to the national authorities instead of the European authorities. So we have to notice this. We have to take into account all this, that Europe is one of the players, and not the player that is the most appreciated for the vaccination success, because at the end of the day, it is a success. So when you have a bad or not a so good public image, then you're speaking about, let's say, communication problems. And they try to solve it by a stronger communication.
But having classic EU dilemma, as always, the negative bit, when it was a bit of a struggle at the beginning, when getting the supplies moving through was an EU problem, the solution, as you say now, the vaccines being delivered and every country looking at themselves in the league table, Belgium, for example, doing astonishingly well, having done pretty badly right at the beginning, it's become national. So the success gets owned nationally and the failure remains with the EU. Is that just a communications problem? Is it a competence problem? I mean, is there anything that can be done? Because it really is symptomatic of a more underlying problem for the European Union. Always gets the blame, never gets the credit.
Yeah, but I would suggest to have a broader view on all this and not to be focused on the very short term. Yeah. At the end of the day, it's about results. And if the results are good, and we are speaking about the vaccination process and the recovery policy, then after some while, people will recognize also the merits of the operation conducted by the European Union. So if you are only focusing on day-to-day, of course, you only see the problems. If you are leaning a little bit backwards, and if you have a longer term view, I'm not so pessimistic at all. Don't forget, according to Eurobarometers, you have a lot of let's say, the confidence in the European Union has not decreased dramatically, on the contrary. And when it is about expectations, then we have to say that they are expecting much more of the European Union. They are not becoming Eurosceptic. They are even becoming, let's say, demanding more European integration and more European cooperation.
Thank you. Janis, whether you agree with that assessment or not, and also at this point, how well prepared do you think the EU is? Oh, we lost Herman momentarily. Hopefully he'll be back in a second. How well do you think the EU is prepared for whatever comes next, a potential fourth wave and so on?
Well, with the first part, I think that Herman is right when he says it makes sense to take a step back and to look on the situation. We do not know what the final verdict of people, citizens, will be with respect to how the EU has handled this crisis, because we're still not we haven't overcome it yet. However, the voices of those who argue no EU would be better, I don't see that these voices are strong. Now you can argue, does that mean that one is happy with how the EU has performed? No, that's not what it's signaling, but it's also not signaling things which we've seen in the past in other crises. If you go back over the last more than a decade and you look into different phases of the polycrisis, as we called it in the past, and now the permacrisis, we've seen that there was a strong proportion of citizens who were saying, the EU is doing us bad. The EU is something which is negative. It's not good to be part of this EU. And we saw that over a long period of time. Now, this is not the general sentiment. Again, I'm not saying that people are overconfident and over happy with the EU. I'm not naive, but this is different from what we've experienced in other crises in the past. The negative attitude is by far not as strong as it had been. So the EU is not being fundamentally challenged or even existentially challenged. Now, with respect to are we better placed? Well, it depends on what you compare it to. If you compare the current situation to 1 year ago, I think the answer is a clear yes, we are better placed. We have effective vaccines, which a year and a half ago, we were dreaming about having. We have capacities, production capacities, which have been increased so we can provide vaccines to people. We have created a system at national level. We don't have a European vaccination strategy, but we have national vaccination strategies, which increasingly work better when we think of the third jab. We're in a different position. The testing methods have much improved, and the knowledge about the virus has improved. So I think if you compare it to where we were a year ago, we are definitely in a better situation. Are we perfectly placed to deal with whatever comes and is in front of us? And we now are talking about Delta variant. I assume that at some point we will talk about an Epsilon variant. So there's a lot of uncertainty. So are we perfectly placed in order to be able to deal with what's coming ahead of us? No, but we're much better off than
Indeed. But Fabian, and a lot of what Janis is talking about there is thanks to science. We have a vaccine, we have better testing and all of those things. But you said the difficulty is still to come. Your assessment of where we are now in terms of, with all these initiatives, European Health Union, et cetera, are we better placed now than we were?
I think certainly I would agree we're better placed. We have started a number of things. But I think I'm going to be the half-empty guy because I think, firstly, on many of the issues, we're still looking at delivery. We're still looking at actually seeing it happening on the ground. And if we are being hit by another wave of this pandemic, by another variant, then how prepared are we for that at that moment? We could easily go back into a situation where healthcare capacities are stretched, where we are in difficult situations. And at the moment, I think there is an understandable wish not to discuss some of these things. But I think we should be starting the discussion about, for example, what do we need to think about in terms of a third shot? What do we need to think about in terms of developing new vaccines for the variants which are going to come? What should we do about children? How are we going to deal with a situation when we go back to school, to university after the summer? All of these things, I think, are still open. And if we're being hit by another wave, that's going to be difficult. I think there is also a real difficulty in the discrepancies between different countries. Different countries continue to do different things, which also impact on others. And I think we have to recognize that European citizens are also reading the news from other countries. They are seeing that in some countries, for example, we are now in a situation where teenagers are going to be vaccinated. In other countries, they're saying no. That is a difficult picture. I think what we're also going to see is, in economic terms, the differential impact of this crisis is going to increase. So yes, we have all been hit by the same crisis, but the effect is going to be very different in different countries. And that is going to be accentuated as some countries re-emerge, as some countries bounce back from this crisis, and others will struggle. And I think this is going to be the big challenge, which will also have political consequences. And finally, and I've mentioned this before at the updates as well, I think we are still not clear about the nature of the economic crisis we are facing. What we have at the moment in terms of, for example, the very positive GDP numbers, but there's a big rebound effect there. You've forcibly shut everything down. The moment you let some of those controls go, you will get a rebound. But is that sustainable? Is that also going to work given the debt levels we have, not just public debt, but private debt, given the number of businesses which are not viable anymore? So I think there's a real question about how are we going to manage the economic difficulties, in particular in a differential way.
Thank you. And Herman, you talked in your opening remarks about the economic recovery, one of your signs of hope that the economic recovery is better than expected, and that, for example, in many countries, it's a sort of V. But Fabian saying, yeah, inevitable rebound effect, that doesn't actually tell us how bad it's going to be as all the impacts of COVID unwind. So comment to that if you would. And also, you talked about the recovery fund and its importance as a structural instrument, an instrument of structural improvement. Do you believe that moment last July, when the EU came to the deal on this massive recovery fund and common debt, which many described as the EU's Hamiltonian moment, the first time the EU was allowed to have collective debt? Was it, how significant was it in history? So first a word to that point about the recovery, and then to, still looking back, just how big a moment was July last year?
Mm-hmm. For sure, it was not a Hamiltonian moment. For me, the biggest moment of the last decades was the creation of the euro. That was really Hamiltonian. It changed profoundly the very nature of the European Union. Having one currency for 17 or 19 countries in the 19th century, you had one country with 19 currencies, and so that was really Hamiltonian. But it was a very important moment. I will not say, as Jean-Claude Juncker said, that I told you so. I was in favor of Eurobonds 10 years ago, and now we have Eurobonds. And that's what he said. But it is something very special, because we have now bonds issued by the European Commission, can be even an investment product. It can enhance the status of the euro, and it is also, let's say, at the level of principles, something totally new and unexpected. And for sure, a year ago, nobody had imagined that this could have been possible. So it's important, but it is not what is called Hamiltonian. On the recovery, you can always draw the list of difficulties. That's for sure. But there are two ways of looking at things. What did we expect, worst case, or what were the hopes, and what is still ahead? What are the challenges? When you compare these to what we feared, we are doing rather well now. We know that there are rising inequalities inside the countries and among the countries. We are in the same storm, but not necessarily in the same boat. But again, we acted, and the recovery fund was partially created to help one of the main countries in the European Union, Italy, severely hit by the pandemic, and also in a very difficult economic situation, depending on tourism, and after decades of slow growth. So we had to do something in order not only to save the credibility of Italy, but to save the credibility of the Eurozone. If we had not acted, I'm sure that we would have had a new Eurozone crisis. Not only we prevented this, but we turned this in an opportunity, and launching this big climate program and digital program. If some are saying the business as usual will not come back, yes, but for different reasons than you could expect. The business as usual model is not going to happen, because we are now launching, on this very moment, if the Commission is launching his climate change package, which profoundly change also our way of life. not only our economy, but the way we are looking at things. Remember that 2 years ago, you had these demonstrations in the streets all over Europe of young people about climate change. And now we are launching this major program. We are taking the lead in world climate policies. So we turn this opportunity, threat to the Eurozone, we turn it in something extremely positive. Of course, we have to implement all this. We have to implement all this. And there will be difficulties. There will be difficulties. But let us look at what we realized. I fully agree with Fabian that let's say there are challenges ahead. There are challenges ahead also in public debt, but also in private debt. And by the way, not only in Europe, also in the United States, and also even in China. When you look at the figures of public and private debt in all over the world, we need a strong rebound of our economies in order to absorb this, and we need stronger surveillance on the monetary side, on the banking side, to prevent a new financial crisis. So, but overall, I keep my assessment, and I think it is important that we give as much as possible, for sure, for political leaders to give a message of hope, notwithstanding all the difficulties we have, because otherwise we fall into the trap of despair.
Thank you. I want to come back on that and what we need to do to avoid that trap and that implementation challenge. As you say, we already have a question from the audience about the Green Deal digital. We'll come back to the detail in a moment. But Janis, on whether it was a Hamiltonian moment, Herman says no, very important, very significant, but not the euro was that moment for the EU. How do you read that? And as the money begins to flow, we've had the national recovery plans approved now, how would you assess what happened then and where we are now in terms of turning that into action? And then we'll move to the future.
Yes, well, first of all, and we've said that in the past, and from the first moment, we have argued that this is not a Hamiltonian moment. Because if it would be a Hamiltonian moment, I think we would have to argue that from that moment onwards, there was a development of the European Union which qualitatively changed its nature. I don't see that. Yes, the moment NextGenerationEU, the moment we experienced in July and December last year, were key moments. They were extremely important, but they were a concrete reaction to a concrete challenge. Which, by the way, also politically is extremely important because, and that was interesting when you see in the countries who have been critical of Eurobonds, you mentioned the term, Herman, the political elites were arguing this is not a Hamiltonian moment. It is something which is very specific because they knew what kind of discussions that would trigger with constitutional courts, but also political discussions. So overstating things, calling it a Hamiltonian moment was a bit also counterproductive. Now, it is important, and I think also when we get into difficult situations in future, we will remember what we did in 2020. So there is a moment, there will be moments where we will remember this was the solution we took at that time, and then we might use it again or learn from that experience when it comes to dealing with future crises. So don't underestimate the importance. And as Herman was alluding to, just imagine for a second, if there would not have been an agreement in May between Germany and France, not an agreement in July and December among the EU member states, where we would have found ourselves. The negative spillovers would have been huge. Also, our ability to deal with the concrete health challenges of the COVID-19 crisis would have been huge because these things are interlinked. So it was a very, very important moment, but not a Hamiltonian moment. Now, I know we're going to go into the future, but I think what will come up is that at some point, we will have to relook at what we did and decided in 2020 and decide as to whether was this enough. How do the differentiated impact, the economic impact, as Fabian was alluding to in the different member states, how does that develop? Is there a danger that some of the, I will call them ghosts of the past re-emerge? The debt issue was already mentioned, but also the role of the ECB, the potentially us versus them discussions which might come up if some countries are much more struggling and more long-term struggling with the economic consequences of the crisis. So I think this re-looking moment will come, and then there will be other tough decisions which will have to be taken. And I'm not sure that without the severe pressure of the crisis, that the right decisions will be taken when we get there. But again, without NextGenerationEU, we'll be in a much more difficult situation.
Fabian, would you, you described yourself as glass half empty in answer to my last question. Does what Herman and Janis have said resonate with you, or do you remain resolutely glass half empty?
I think that in the sense of the recovery, the NextGenerationEU, the glass is half full, maybe even more than half full, because we actually did also learn from the last crises, particularly the last economic and financial crisis, that you have to react faster, that you have to react more decisively, and that you have to break some taboos. There were certain reasons why that was possible in this particular case, not least because the pandemic was a symmetric shock which was hitting everyone. So there wasn't this idea of blame attached to it. But in the end, it did happen. And I think both Herman and Janis are absolutely right that if it hadn't happened, it would have been a disaster. So it is an extremely significant moment for the European Union. But I think where I am a bit glass half empty is also starting to look ahead, starting to see some of the fault lines re-emerging. And as we are not returning to normality, but as we are going into a different phase of this crisis, I think some of the discussions, for example, are starting again in Germany on inflation. I think these are the kind of things which are warning signals. Another warning signal, which we've also discussed at the update, the German Constitutional Court, and the kind of role we are starting to see with kickback from certain countries. The ongoing difficulties in resolving the rule of law issues, maybe even the increased difficulties now with some of the actors. So I think there are some areas here where we could very well be in a very difficult territory by the end of this year, beginning of next year. Politically, at the same time, we have these major political transitions with we don't know yet what the outcome of the German election is going to be, but we know that the era Merkel is over. We have the big challenge of the French presidential election. And some of those conflicts we've seen in the past might well re-emerge in that context.
Indeed. Indeed, lots to come to, and you mentioned rule of law. I would like very much to come back to that, but of course, because of course an ongoing discussion right at this moment. But Herman, let me come to you, and as we turn to look at the future, and Fabian there worrying, he says those fault lines are re-emerging. We could be in very difficult territory by the end of the year. Your overall assessment in terms of the challenge ahead, both the challenge, but also you spoke a lot about opportunity and turning crisis and threats into opportunities. The most important challenges, but also the most important opportunities for the EU to make a difference. Just some opening thoughts, if you would, Herman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was reflecting, preparing this talk about what should Ursula von der Leyen tell us in our State of the Union. By the way, the President of the European Council never delivered the speech of the State of the Union. No.
Should he or she?
we were not accountable to the Parliament, so we could not have this happy moment of delivering that kind of speech. So it's a frustration. It's a frustration. But some reflections about what she could say, and before I embark on that issue. Last year did not need a geopolitical commission. Remember that she spoke in the beginning about the geopolitical commission, but we need a political commission because the focus was on the fighting of the pandemic within Europe. So I don't even like the word political commission, but if we want to use those words, they were not geopolitical due to the pandemic. So what's on the agenda next year? The focus will be on implementation of the vaccination strategy, implementation of the Green Deal, of the Recovery Fund, of the new industrial policy of cooperation to make the EU more competitive and more strategically autonomous, implementation also on the Asylum and Migration Pact. There's a lot of work to be done. And of course, implementation on the rule of law conditionality of the allocation of structural funds. So there is already a big program, and executing that, implementing that will take a lot of time, and for sure a lot of time next year. And then you have the issue of the rule of law, and Fabian touched upon it already. For me, it's an existential problem for the Union, and if we don't find an adequate answer to this, it can lead to an existential crisis. So I don't underestimate what is happening in Poland and in Hungary. Also in Poland, there is a big discussion about the supremacy of EU law, of the role of the European Court of Justice, the supremacy of his rulings, and above the rulings of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal. We know what's happening in Hungary. That is really a case, and the last European Council showed it very clearly. It's the first time that the European Council is speaking about violations of EU values, the first time. Before that, it was the Commission was in charge, and now the European Parliament is pushing the Commission and the European Council. So the three institutions are now involved in this rule of law issue. Of course, we have to look what will happen inside those countries. And in Hungary, they will have elections. In Poland, they will have elections, I think, in 2 years' time. So that's a big issue. Implementation of previous agreements, rule of law issue. And then you have the elaboration of the strategic autonomy. For me, it's a key concept of the European Union. It's going much further than just the economy or the digital. It's about energy, migration, medical equipment, medicines. There's a long list of the domains where it can be strategically much more autonomous. You will have the discussion next year about the Stability and Growth Pact, and Fabian was alluding to that. It's inevitable, but personally, I do not see an agreement on such a controversial subject. And the Commission will further need to interpret the pact in a flexible manner. In any case, I know what the problems are. I'm a former minister of the budget, but austerity is the last thing the public is waiting for, the very last thing, at least in 2022. Then you have our relationship with Russia, especially with China. Also there, the European Council spoke about it in the last meeting. It must be clarified because we have not a common position, not only due to our internal the discussions, but the topic in itself inside the West is a very controversial topic. Should we allow ourselves to be dragged along by the United States? Question mark. Trump was too soft on Russia and too hard on China, and we wanted the opposite. Most of us wanted the opposite. Biden is tough on both because he does not want to give the impression of being weaker than Trump regarding Russia and China. So there is a lot of domestic politics in America's foreign policy. And are we just following? will we be strategically autonomous. On the conference of the future of Europe, but Janis can speak much more and better than I can do on this. But for me, the focus is on strengthening European democracy, both participative democracy and representative democracy. There is need for more citizen democracy and a greater role of national, regional, and local mandatories, simply because they are closer to the citizens. So we'll see, democracy is under pressure. I heard this morning the speech of President Biden, what's happening in the United States, restricting voting rights and so on. It's under pressure because democracy is attacked not only in the United States, but also in our own country, in our own countries, and not only in Hungary and Poland. People, especially young people, don't believe as much in the importance of the value of political democracy as we did. And there is this demand that democracy must deliver. It must deliver on various fronts: less unemployment, less pollution, less irregular migration. The list is long. So the people are asking that not only Europe, but also the national democracies delivers. And this is also one of the big topics of the conference of the future of Europe. My last remark is a very general one. I was asking myself if is there an all-embracing word in which next year's policy should be summarized. I think that many people yearn for stability. Their lives have been turned upside down enough already in 2020, 2021. And I feel that society wants to take a breather. Besides what's in the pipeline already involves enough changes. And I mentioned climate policy will profoundly change our way of life and trigger a public debate about burden sharing. So I would not now like to put any new fears in the minds of citizens. And that's an advice I would give to Ursula von der Leyen, because many people yearn for stability after those unbelievable years 2020 and 2021. Nobody could have imagined that we would live in that kind of situation. So we know that we need some changes, and they're already in the pipeline. I mentioned climate change, but try not to overload the wagon. Otherwise, you will have a backlash, and populism will take benefit of it.
Thank you very much. Janis, you wanted to come in on that, and if you would, on that overall assessment, we can delve into some of the detail to the extent that time allows in a moment, and I want to take a question from the audience that we have on the Green Deal. But your overall assessment, would you agree with the challenges as outlined by Herman? Would you add anything? Do you think anything's missing from that picture?
I'll try to present a bigger picture of things. And I think that, we know what many of the concrete challenges are. I can also already imagine what in the speech of Ursula von der Leyen will be included. It will be a potpourri of a lot of different things. But if you try to take the bigger picture and link it also to the debate we had about the past 18 months about the COVID-19 crisis, I think the biggest challenge will be, and I'll explain what I mean, is our ability to adapt to the post-COVID-19 reality. This is the biggest challenge. And I still think that we are underestimating, if we think 5 or 10 years ahead, we are underestimating how this COVID-19 crisis will be affecting the future in our lives in future. Not in a narrow sense in terms of, the health crisis, but and we said that from rather early in the beginning of the crisis, that this crisis in many ways is an accelerator. It's like a catalyst. It's pushing developments which have already started, which have already been moving even further and even faster. And I think this is what we're seeing happening in front of us. The good old days are gone thinking, some of the people who still, yearn to go back to where we were, as if the period before COVID-19 was so nice and so positive. I think that's a misreading, but it's also something which is illusionary. And if I look into what the post-COVID-19 reality will look like and what the accelerators are, I think it is increasing the transitional pressures which we're facing. And I think it's 4 areas where it is increasing. One is, it is showing us that, we don't have time to lose when it comes to climate change. The COVID-19 experience told us, people were telling us that what happened would happen, that we were warned about it. We are being warned about climate change and its potential consequences for years, for decades. And now I think the pressure is even stronger. The digital transformation, which we witnessed over the past 18 months, is just a small proportion of what we will have to see in terms of the technological developments ahead of us. It's multiple difficult technological revolutions moving us into a digital transformation, which is inconceivable. The global transformation in terms of the balance of powers or the imbalance of powers in future, the global disorder or order of the future. The crisis is having an immense impact on that. And then democratic adaptation. We need to adapt our representative democracy to new realities. So we're having a major transformational moment ahead of us. The COVID-19 crisis is pushing it even more. And then there's this danger of exhaustion, because here, Herman is right. There is this feeling of society wants a breather. I don't think that it's only society. I think it's also politics who want to have a breather, but we don't have time to take a step back, take a breath, and then say, well, we can take care of these major transitional challenges later on. We can't.
We need to discuss them.
And just one last point, and that's where the Conference on the Future of Europe comes in. Because the conference potentially allows us to have a debate about this major transitional challenges which we have in front, and become a pressure function for things which have to be done after the conference. The conference doesn't end in the spring of next year.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry to bring you to a halt, but you're raising so many issues and we haven't got very long. Fabian, Janis talking there about those big trends, but then saying, but we don't have time to, we have to move now. What is your assessment then in the here and now? And Herman, I'll ask you what your key word for her speech would be a bit later on. But as she prepares her State of the Union speech, what sort of areas do you think it should be focusing on, i.e. what for you are the challenges? Do you agree with what we've heard so far? Would you put the emphasis somewhere else?
When we look at the challenges we're facing, I think there's no shortage of challenges. And to some extent, we know what they are, but that doesn't make them easier to deal with. And I do understand what Herman was also mentioning about the wish for stability, that people want to feel protected, that they want to feel that there is a future in which they can be more confident about things than they have been in the recent past. But I do also worry about, we've always talked about the expectation capability gap. I also worry about the hope reality gap. That I think some of these trends are so deep and are so radical that it's going to be very difficult to deliver that level of stability. It's going to be very difficult to deliver a feeling that things are not in constant flux and constant change. And the pandemic is just adding to that. So I think Ursula von der Leyen has to find the right balance between preparing people realistically for the continuing challenges, because if she doesn't do that, we're going to be in a situation where I think the backlash is going to be even stronger. If we are getting into a situation where, for example, populations expect that by next spring, beginning of next year, the pandemic is under control, and it is not at that point, I think we are going to have a backlash. So I think, and this is where the difficulty comes in with putting this into one word. I can't put it into one word. I've put down 5 Ps. Partnership. We need to look also at the global level of how we build the partnerships, what we do with the US in particular, given that we have before the midterms to do that. Progress, we actually have to deliver on the things, not just setting the objectives, but actually getting the money on the ground, making sure that we deliver on the Green Deal, on digital, on recovery. Protection, I think this is going to continue to be a strong theme. Strategic autonomy was already mentioned, but also the very basic protection against the health threat, the pandemic. Preparedness, I think we need to be better prepared for the next crisis, not just for the current one. We have to build those instruments, we have to build foresight. And finally, and I think Janis already mentioned that, participation. We have to make sure that also our democracy is healthy and that citizens feel that they can participate in those decisions.
Thank you very much. Hannah, can I just come back and linking to what Janis and Fabian just been said? You talked about this yearning for stability, but you also talked, for example, you said there is no return to business as usual, and you pointed out the Fit for 55 package, the climate package being unveiled by the Commission probably as we speak. And you said very profound transformations. So how do we combine that stability? You said changes, but not too many, not too much. The public can't cope with it at the moment. But we have this huge ambition, and you describe the Green Deal as the biggest moment since the foundation of the single market. And Verena Ringler from the audience says, dear Mr. President, many thanks for your thoughts of hope, but on the Green Deal, working in Europe's regions rather than capital cities over the past few months, she says, it is becoming clear that polarization and toxification of the debate are arguably the biggest risks related to the European Green Deal right now. People seeing this as being handed down by the EU. So her question is, how can national or even regional governments help to improve acceptance of the European Green Deal from below and make it a two-way street? All of this, so stability on the one hand and complete transformation on the other. How do you reconcile the two?
Mm-hmm. I said that people were yearning for stability, but at the same time that I was very much aware that, for instance, on climate change, we are facing a major challenge, and the burden sharing, that's the person who asked the question, the burden sharing is of key importance in all this. Setting targets and setting up new instruments is one thing, but at the end of the day, people are looking, am I paying more, and who is paying less than I am paying? And so you have this discussion about the distribution of the burden. But what I meant to say is the following. In a political discourse, you always have two sides. One is related to stability, a very vague concept, Stability and trust, and on the other hand, change. And it's not the first time that we have to reconcile those things. Of course, this is a very special moment. And don't forget, after 10 years of crisis, what we called here in the EPC, the poly crisis, the multiple crisis, it's not the first crisis that is happening. It's a long series of crises. So I think the tone of the State of the Union message is of key importance. And that this tone has to be a tone of, we did good things last year. We overcame, again, as we overcame the Eurozone crisis, the refugee crisis, we overcame this pandemic. Well, it's not completely over, we don't know all this, but it was a major step. And even if there is a fourth wave, it will be much less deadly than the previous ones, for the simple reason that in some countries, even 80–90% of the population will be vaccinated in the upcoming weeks and months. So the tone is of key importance. I will not say that we have to say, wir schaffen das. I'm confident that we will manage it. For the reason that you can imagine. I will not say, yes, we can, as Obama did. He knew that there were a lot of challenges ahead when he started his presidency, and he didn't deliver he met not all the expectations. But there has to be in the tone something that we were together in the same storm, and now we know that we are facing a lot of problems, but we can do it together. And this appeal to togetherness and to solidarity, it's not just a word. It's not just a word. It's also translating a part of reality. When I was vaccinated in my country, and when I saw how many volunteers are working with a queue even of people who wanted to help, it went extremely well, not only in my country, also in many other countries. So that there is something in the population that I will not say that changed, but something also positive that emerged about all this. So do I have to make an appeal to those positive forces in society to face the upcoming problems? I'm speaking now more about the rhetoric, the tone, and the main message that you should give. The list of problems, we know the list of problems is long, but this is not the moment to raise your finger and say, look, we have managed to do this and this, and now this will happen, and if this is not happening, then the other catastrophe will happen. That's not the right way of speaking to people today. That was what I meant to say in the last part of my introduction. It has more to do with, let's say, the political discourse than it has to do with substance.
And that's an interesting point, Fabian, in terms of yes, we've delved into some of the issues, lots more we could have discussed if we have more time, but getting that message of hope that Herman said, that message of stability, but also that message of change. He says the key is togetherness, solidarity. If you weave that through the speech, then you can bring those elements together. Would you agree with that?
I think certainly it's a very important element. The question for me is, how do you then translate that into a reality which is felt by people? And I think when we're looking at the major transitions we are facing, including also the transition from COVID and the economic transition which will follow, but the digital transition, the green transition, then the big challenge with all of these transitions is how are we going to manage to make these transitions acceptable to all parts of our populations? How do we make the green transition just so that we have the political backing behind it? So far, in most cases, we have treated this as an afterthought. We have tried to add a little bit of social Europe at the end. Yes, there's a major funding program now with NextGenerationEU, which is helping also those countries specifically who are further behind. But I think a lot more needs to be done to make sure that solidarity is not a word, but it is actually something which people can feel in their daily lives. And that's going to be especially important as we are entering a new phase of the pandemic and the consequences, as we've mentioned, because we are going to see very asymmetric impacts, and we're already starting to see some of the tensions of it. How do we deal, for example, with countries which are very dependent on tourism, who are now opening up in a way which is perceived by other countries as being irresponsible? So these are exactly when real solidarity is about how do we deal with these kind of situations.
Thank you. Janis?
I think that the point which Herman raised when you mentioned the word tone, the tone you give, I think this is extremely significant. We live in time of narrative politics. The narrative you give to things is key, has been and is now even more key than it was in the past. And I think that this notion of change versus stability is providing the wrong picture. It's providing as if, we can choose between the one or the other. I think that these are extremely linked with each other. How can you have stable societies, stable economies in a transitional moment as the one I was describing earlier, if you do not change? You require that change in order to be able to have stability in so many different fields at the end of the day. So it's not this dichotomy, and bringing these two things together is important. And I think that, because you were saying what would be the advice for Ursula von der Leyen and those who are now working on the speech, I think one needs to start with the mega lessons of the past 18 months. The Commission produced a paper asked by the European Council to do so on the lessons learned. I think that paper is very narrow. It's focusing too much on health issues, and it's not self-critical enough. Self-critical in terms of the Commission, but also in terms of the European Union in total. So if you look into the mega lessons of the past 18 months, I think there are some, and they're not negative. The fact that we responded early, the fact that we understood that it is in all our collective interest, enlightened self-interest, to react in a way to the crisis which then shows solidarity, but out of the right reason of self-interest. The fact that we cannot move to a Fata Morgana, which is the old good old days. Yeah. It would be a Fata Morgana. If you take these lessons and then you translate them into what that means for the future, and I believe in that yes, we are facing major challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities. Just take the digital example of the last 18 months. This has changed our lives profoundly. I spoke earlier of a cultural change, and it's not only a threat. And I think that it includes a lot of opportunities. And I think that you can confront people with the challenges, but also the opportunities of what is in front of us, and link these things of stability and change with each other.
Okay, sorry to hurry you, but we are almost out of time. We need to finish on time today. Two quick questions, and then maybe come back with a concluding one. But Herman, on the rule of law, I just wanted to quickly come back on that, because you said this is potentially an existential problem for Europe. We've been wrestling with it now for a long time, and more increasingly dominant in the debate at the moment. New appeals for the Commission to use its new powers to suspend funding to Hungary. How can we find that adequate answer? Briefly, if you would. I know. I'm asking you for a short answer on the most difficult question.
Yeah. I'm not a lawyer. I'm only an economist. So don't ask me how, because there's a technical legal aspect on all this. Even with the mechanism we set up in the framework of the recovery fund, it's not giving all the answers. And we have seen that with the new Hungarian legislation on the LGBTI people, that's not foreseen. That kind of legislation and that kind of violation of fundamental laws is not foreseen, to my knowledge, in the mechanism of the conditionality in the link to the recovery fund. So, but let's say there is now a moment where the three institutions, the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament, put these high on the political agenda. If there are no changes, and if there is another way of provocation in those countries, then, and I'm not saying more than that, we will face a major problem inside the Union. Mm-hmm. And it's not only Hungary, but also what the rulings of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal about as I said, the supremacy of the European Court of Justice and European law in general. If they are not respecting the European rule of law, or the rule of law enshrined in the treaties, then we are facing and we are touching upon an existential problem. I'm not saying more than that. I'm not saying delicate enough. Yeah.
Absolutely. Fabian, I hate to bring it up, but we can't end a discussion of the past 12 months and the 12 months to come without a mention of the dreaded B word. We are where we are. We discussed where we were at our last update. Not much has changed since then. But looking ahead to the next 12 months, is there any possibility that if we have this discussion 12 months from now, we won't even have to talk about Brexit or the EU-UK relations?
Just one word on the rule of law. I think it's also very important that Germany sorts itself out, because if we have the major member state having this sword hanging over it, that the supremacy of European law continues to be questioned in that member state, then it is very easy for other member states to also go down the same route. So this needs to be sorted out. This needs to have a very, very high political priority, and it needs some courage from German politicians to also deal with the Constitutional Court and to deal with that rather difficult political group within the German state. But I think on Brexit, unfortunately, I think it is the topic which will not go away. Because it is not in the interest of the United Kingdom to come to a conclusion which is satisfactory for all sides. This is going to continue to be the domestic stick which Boris Johnson uses to try to hit his opponents with. He can always try to shift every blame for everything which goes wrong on the European Union. And the problem of Northern Ireland is not going to go away. Because we have a fundamental issue there, which has to do with a long-term future where you have different communities completely opposed to each other. So we are going to have the UK on the agenda. But in that context, I think it's very important that the EU actually recognizes this, because there's a real fatigue now. People want to get this off the agenda. They don't want to think about Brexit anymore. But the reality is, it is something we still have to deal with.
Indeed. And in one sentence, of your 5 Ps, partnership, progress, protection, preparedness, and participation, which one, if you had to pick one of those for focus, I know it's a completely unfair question, which P for you is the most important?
I will say preparedness, because that's the one we always forget. As soon as the immediate crisis is over, we don't actually go back and fix the things which need to be fixed for the next one.
Janis, in a couple of sentences, sorry, we're almost out of time. For you, of all the issues we've discussed, Herman gave us his sort of leitmotif, his thread, and you talked about how to change that narrative. We live in a time of narrative politics. If you had to sum that up in one sentence in Ursula's speech, how would you do so? Completely impossible, I know.
Yes, it is impossible, but at the same time, it needs to be delivered, huh? Because if you want to provide a narrative, that's what you need to do. And there's a German word, and as our Commission President is a German, I'll use the German word. It's Aufbruchstimmung. It is the sense of a new beginning. And it's not a very good translation of the word Aufbruchstimmung. I wasn't able to come with a better translation of it. But what I said earlier, understanding the concerns of people, while making sure that the realization of changing is the basis for us to be able to cope with the challenge we have in front of us. Whether this is a difficult political task or not, and by the way, it's not a task which the Commission can deliver on its own. We all know that. I still think that it's the task which we all have ahead of us.
Thank you very much. And Herman, a final word from you. You talked about that appeal to togetherness and solidarity, so I'm not going to ask you to repeat that, but just a final thought on when we meet again, hopefully to have this conversation a year from now. What for you will be the key to us having a conversation where we say, yep, we faced up to that challenge, we faced up to that, and we did turn fear into hope?
Yeah. I feel now like a pastor at the end of a meeting or a mass, and giving some kind of blessing to all the participants, and speaking nice words. I think we said everything during our conversation, and even if we did, some nuances were different, and if the tone is something different, I think the basic message is the same. The basic message is the same. And so how to combine this longing for stability with this need for change, that's a key issue. But in any case, we saw in the last 12 months, at least those of 18 months, we saw a lot of signs of hope, and let's build upon that. Let's build upon that. And I saw those signs of hope not only in policies, I saw also in society. And I think that people are very much aware that the old world will not come back. You have not to explain them. They know it. They simply know it. But let's not make them more fearful than they already are, and let's bring them and let's bring them from one stage to another, and let's do it in a fair way, in a way that is supporting solidarity and togetherness. Otherwise, we will fail. We will fail.
And on that note, and I'm going to take the optimistic out of our conversation because we need to do that on the eve of the summer holidays. Thank you so much to all three of you, but particularly thank you, Herman Van Rompuy, not just for today, but for all the support and work you do for the EPC, which I know is much appreciated by all the team. That is all we have time for. Just one publication to mention. There's going to be something coming out today, very important, relating to the EU's view of the world and the links with its colonial past. There's going to be a policy dialogue tomorrow on that Fit for 55 package. I know you're all watching and waiting for it today from the Commission, and there's going to be a policy dialogue to discuss that. That's it from us for updates before the summer. We're going to take a break, but we'll be back in September with Fabian, with Janis, with more guests, and I hope on a very regular basis with you also, President Van Rompuy. But thank you all very much. Thank you to those of you who join us every time we meet and put such interesting questions and comments. It only remains for me to wish you a very happy summer, a safe summer, and I hope you all get a chance to relax and think about things other than the existential crises facing the European Union just for a few short weeks. But thank you very much. See you after the summer. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.